Welcome back, everyone. This is the Vintage Sewing Machine Garage, and I'm making a new installment on my video where I've been focusing on the Singer potted motor. I believe in the last video you guys, let's see, there was a video where I talked about the motor, and then the next one is where I show you how to take it off and to undo the wiring for it, which I find it a lot easier to inspect and work on the motor with it uninstalled at the wire. This particular wire is in really good shape. There's no cracking, there's no splitting, and this machine, I don't know the exact year of production, but you always want to check that because the potted motors, there is a grommet here. I don't know if you guys can see that right there. I need something to point with. There's a rubber grommet here. These grommets can often be split or gone entirely, or kind of sometimes they become chemically unstable and they ooze or melt. And that grommet's very important because that insulates your cord against the metal of the machine. So that's an important feature you want to check. And again, with my cord here, it's still flexible, which is remarkable given how old it is. But many of them do need to have new wiring put in. I mean, that's the nature of them. And I don't know if it's because the potted motors don't have a vent. They don't they vent their heat through the steel, but there's not any kind of a grill or screen where warm air can escape. I don't know if that's the reason or if it's just because they're old. Most vintage sewing machine motors can be quite old, so you always want to inspect all of those that you come across if you are overhauling a machine, or even when you just get a machine you want to sew with. You want to make sure it's safe to use. Now, what I was pointing with here, of course, is one of these special precision tip Q-tips. Now, the Q-tip brand has these. I haven't seen them in a generic brand yet, and here's one of the more generic or regular cotton swabs, and they're both really good at holding on to cleaners and or sewing machine oil. You can use them a lot. I find that the precision tips are a little more helpful. They are denser to my mind, and they're pointed, yes, but they typically don't shred as easily because I'm using these to get grease out of this little area here. There are different ways you can do it. I'm wearing gloves because I don't want grease on my hands. Try to remember to do that. But one of the things you can do, there are different ways to do this inside area here, which is where remember the hand wheel, when the motor's back on the machine, the hand wheel is going to be going in for the hand wheel gear to connect to your worm gear there. And I'm going to do a separate video on how to clean that gear on the hand wheel, because Textilite gear should be cleaned with a little more gentle application. But anyway, you can see here I've been going down here and just pulling out old, dirty, nasty grease and just sort of finishing that up. There's not a ton in here. You'll get grease here. Now, you can decide how retentive you want to be about this. Old grease is not very, it's obviously been still lubricating the motor, but I really like to get as much old grease as I can out of here, right? So I'm going to I have a paper towel and I've got alcohol in it. Remember again, remember this precious beautiful black paint. Don't get the alcohol on the paint. And I'm just going to come in here, and there's not a ton left on this surface, but you can see I'm just coming in to and this is probably more aesthetic. You don't even have to do this. Just get the majority of the, any big clumps of grease in here. You want to get it out, and because you're going to make room for the new grease that you're going to be putting in. And again, if you want to get down into the grooves, you can use a cotton swab and to get down in here. If you really want to be anal about it. But again, the main thing is to get any dried grease and major areas of old grease out of here. How far you go to clean this, this is about function, right? The aesthetics of the machine are not inside, but you want to make sure you're setting it up for a new lifetime of service. So go back in here and poke around. You can see I'm still able to pull out some of that really tired grease. Sometimes this old grease in the Singers, in these potted motors anyway, it will have a green cast to it, and I don't know if that's because of the chemistry changes, or it could be also that you know, there's either brass or bronze in here, and I believe that you know, if you've got brass, I don't know if there's a bearing in here, but there's a brass in here somewhere, and if that brass, come on this inside rim here as well. If that brass forms a patina over time and it turns green, if you've ever seen copper or brass turn a color, then that may explain why sometimes you get a very bright green color to the grease, even though it wasn't green when it was new, to my knowledge. Not that I was there, but that's again one of those theories. Okay, now again, we have cleaning on the outside here to do, but we'll do that in a little bit. But what I wanted to basically do was show you guys this. So I go ahead and get this cleaned out. It's, you know, it's fairly clean here. Wasn't a ton in there. I'm not going to clean the dust out here yet because I don't. I want to kind of focus on my grease here first. So actually, we can do this dust here now. But let me show you a way to do it without getting dust flying and getting inside where your motor gears are. You want to take, I've got a cotton swab here, and I'm just going to put some sewing machine oil on it. And yes, oil is a dust magnet, but it's also going to help us pull dust off of here. Okay. I could also use a hand cleaner, but in this particular situation, I don't think I need it. And as you can see, almost all the dust is sticking to the oil, and that helps keep it from, you know, flying and dropping and working its way into God knows where. And again, we've got this motor in a place where we can reach these little areas pretty easily, because once the motor's back and reinstalled, it can be a bit of a pain to get. What am I doing? It can be a bit of a pain to get in there once the motor's installed, because you've got other things in your way. And or you could actually just take, well, if you take a lint brush and start brushing the dust off, that's one way to get the dust off. But of course, then you're going to send the dust flying, and you want to prevent that. I'm coming here underneath where the bobbin winder is, and we don't have our tire right now, but we will. I have a new tire that will be used to replace this one. Almost out of my spare bobbin tire stash. Gonna have to order some more. Okay, so I've gotten most of these little areas that are hard to get to when this is installed. Gotten those cleared off, and I'll make another check in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of show that to you now. I mentioned to you guys when I first started this that when the motor is installed, the grease, the access to the grease wicks is upside down. So taking the motor off makes it helpful, because you're going to have to turn it right side up, or upside down, I guess you could say, in order to get access to these, because we're going to be changing them. Now I'm going to try to put this in a position where you guys can see it, and I'll be able to zoom in here in just a minute. Now I'm going to take a piece of fabric here, because I need something to lean my motor up against so it'll be upright, but I don't want it to whack against or scratch my machine or the motor. So there we go. That should work. Now, chances are when you go to get these loose, they're not going to budge. Because they've been sitting there a long time. Could have been since it left the factory. It should have gotten service with new grease, but you know what? Don't assume that your machine ever has. So let's see. Got my widest screwdriver tip here, and fortunately these big knurled caps, if you will, screw caps, they're very large, and they have a really deep, straight. Boy, I had to grunt a little bit there, but I was able to get it right, and it's coming loose. Sometimes they're a little harder or easier. And this is one of the beefiest, heaviest cap screws I've ever seen. There it goes. Yeah, this actually didn't fight me as much as I thought it might. And like I say, so we'll start with this one right here. And I'm going to zoom in because I want you to see a little bit better what you're going to see if you decide to do this little procedure. So this is what that big bolt or screw looks like. And if I take my paper towel, you're going to see, you know, we've got some of the old grease there. You can see this sort of the greenish cast that it's developed. But again, that's easy to get off. That's not a huge amount of grease. Now, take a look here. What you see is behind that beautiful steel threading there for the bolt is the top of the wick, and it's being held in by a clip. And the wick is topped by a spring, and they're all held inside by this clip. So we need to get the clip out. And if you don't have a setup at this stage, you really need to lay out a towel, some paper towels, because you are going to have, if yours is like most of these motors, you're going to have old grease coming out, and it's going to be kind of a mess, and you really don't want to learn that later. So let's see, I'm going to try to turn this in such a way you guys can see it, because I know the angle's a little weird. Maybe get a little bit more height here. Maybe that'll help. Here we go. Now, I need tools. What tools can you use? There are different people have different methods for taking this on. I have a pair of these. The word's escaping me. I'm sorry. What you often use to tweezers. Tweezers. There it is. I knew it would pop into my head. Tweezers are, and you know, there are different types of tweezers here, but the same thing you might use to get a splinter out of your hand is not a bad little tool for pulling this specific item out. Okay. Now, this clip that's in here has tension on it like a spring. Okay, and we need to come in here. There's two sides to it. There's the side that's sort of I don't know, oval shaped, and then look at the side here where you see the metal, and if you can't, you may have to scrape a little grease away. That place here is where we're going to try to get our tweezers down on either side, and we're going to squeeze and pull, and sure enough, there it comes. Now, it doesn't always come out this easy, guys. Sometimes you have to struggle, but you also want to be careful, because inside of this is your old wick, and you want to use the old wick as a gauge for measuring your new one. You also want to be extra careful because there is a copper spring in here, and we want to reuse these springs. Usually springs are not an issue about damaging, but they can be for this application. And I'll show this to you. The first thing you're going to see is well, what you see right now is a big old greasy piece here. So let me take a swab and clean off some of this grease so you can see what I actually pulled out of here. Just get some of the worst of it off so you can see what this looks like. Let's see here. Now, we can certainly clean this off. Some people will, you know, dip them in alcohol to get all the grease off. But right now, I just want to show this to you. So let's see if the wick will release Okay, be extra careful because remember there's a spring. We don't want to bend or tear the spring. There it came. Okay, so this is what the clip looks like. And right now, it's still got a bunch of grease in it. So I'm going to come here and literally, should be able to see what I'm doing at the same time I'm doing it. Here, let's hold this like that. And you guys will see, you can see I just took a big clump of grease out of there. And then I can come back and push more of the old grease out. Again, you want to get the old grease out and make room for the new. You can decide if you want to, like I said, you can drop this piece down in the alcohol. You can clean all, get it down nice and shiny. That's really up to you. You want to get the majority of the old grease out because, again, you need room for the new grease. Some of you may have opinions and feel that all the old grease needs to come out with alcohol. I've done it that way before, or, I see old tarnished oil here on the outside. That's not rust. It would be very strange for something like this that's been swimming in grease since 1950 to be rusted, and it's not. Now this piece here, again, when you take it out and you squeeze, notice you squeeze on, I'll show you where I was squeezing. It's kind of sometimes easier to see once it's out. You see the tweezers, right? And I'm squeezing on these two ends. And when I squeeze them together, it allows this to release. So you want to be extra careful. Don't overly bend it because you're going to need this again. Okay, now we have a very grungy looking Wick. This is the original Wick. Well, the Wicks, over time, as the old grease stays in them, they begin to get hard and they don't wick very well. And the ideal way to do this, of course, is to replace it with a new wick, and that's what we're going to do. So I want to do one of these now. Getting the spring off is not, don't just hold the spring and start pulling here, guys, because if you do, there's a good chance you're going to warp or tear, or you're going to mangle your spring in a way that's going to make you unhappy when you go to reuse it. So a couple of ways to try to convince this old spring and old wick to part ways. I'm going to take sewing machine oil, and I'm going to soak it on that wick around the spring. Now, one of the best ways to do this is to hold the spring and try carefully to twist, right, to see if that oil will help the spring release. But do it very carefully. You don't want to pull the wick out. I'm just turning it, and while I'm trying to hold the spring. And if you need, you could always take maybe something like these tweezers. Be careful if you use pliers. Remember, it doesn't take much to crush a spring. You really don't want that happening. So here I'm going to just, now remember, I've got part of the wick is inside the spring, and I don't want to squeeze on the spring here where there's no wick, because that's going to mangle the spring. You want to place pressure on the spring where there's the wick underneath it, okay? And then you're going to turn with your fingers. Just going to go, I don't know if it matters if I go clockwise or counterclockwise, but this is what I'm attempting to do here. I'm trying to convince this spring to say goodbye to the wick. This is one method, right? Now what I'm doing is I'm holding the spring, twisting the wick, and be extra careful when you get to the end, because it's, again, easy to mangle. Okay, that was not too bad, and that was lucky. I've had a lot tougher time in the past, but that spring is pretty intact. I feel really good, because it doesn't always go that way. So, and if you bend the spring somewhat, you can make it work. I've had to do that before, but there you go. Now, the wick itself is not something that typically shortens very much or wears, right? It can a little bit, but it's mostly just been sitting there feeding grease into the bearings of this incredibly well-made motor. Now, save this, don't toss it yet because we're going to use it as a template to make our replacement. Before we do that though, we're not done cleaning. We have one of our little, I call them tanks, but they're really like little pits, and you're going to see old grease come out of it, like that. So let's move our, see if I can shift the camera just a bit here, because I think, and shift the motor, because you're getting, I think you're getting some of the, more of your view of the cord than this little area here. Let's see if we can shift the perspective a little bit. You don't see much in here because it's dark, and it is. Let's see if I can pull this up closer. Now you guys can see, you see steel underneath, and it's kind of a strange little setup, this little grease container. In fact, there's not much in here. So I've had some that were packed, but apparently this had been using up most of its old grease. So I don't have as much to clean out. Oh, let me get my pointed tip, right? I may even just put a little alcohol on that just to make sure that I'm keeping those cotton fibers out of the threads. We don't want that. And not a whole lot of grease here to take out, guys. Sometimes there's a lot. You may have a lot in yours, and it'll come out with cotton swabs. But again, use the higher quality ones. Or you may also find, you may be able to use a paintbrush, an artist brush. You could use that and pull the grease out and just keep wiping the brush. But now, yeah, I'm not getting a ton here. So let's get the flashlight and see if we can give you guys an even better view of what you're looking at. Okay? So take a look. It's kind of a strange shape. To the right is where that wick is going to go. And when we put that in, I'll show you the direction that we're putting the clip. And underneath the clip will be the spring, and underneath that will be the wick. And so that's kind of like the little tank there. It doesn't hold a lot, but it's a very important thing for your machines, for this motor to live a long life. So there we go. That's cleaned out. That didn't take long. It may take you longer sometimes, depending on how bad yours is, or how much old grease you've got. Now we are on to the wick part of this procedure. I'm going to take one of my gloves off here because I need my finger dexterity without the glove in order to make a wick. Now, many of you have asked me in the past, where do you find your supplies? And one of the suppliers I had given to you all was So Classic. It was a wonderful site. It was sew-classic.com, and the owner of that business sold all sorts of new reproduction supplies for overhauling sewing machines. And it was a wonderful site. The prices were very reasonable. Even with shipping, it was still reasonable. And the service was fast, and the quality of the parts, I never had a complaint. Unfortunately, the owner of the business, well, not unfortunately for the owner, they retired and the business closed. I'm not aware that anyone ever took it over. Because of this, I'm currently looking for a new supplier for some of my items, and so stay tuned. I'm working on that. Get some more of the higher quality cotton swabs up here. But I still have wick left, fortunately, that I'd ordered from So Classic, and I am still using it. Now, the wick that I got from So Classic is close, but not exactly the same size as that let's pull this back a little bit. Not quite the same as the original. And so this is a situation where you want to sort of make this work, and you can, right? Because I've shown you guys Wicks before for the white rotary and Kenmore rotary machines. Okay. So here's the thinner wick is what you see me use on the rotary motors. This is the wick that So Classic sold for the potted motors, okay? And it might have been usable for some of the other Singer motors, but this one in particular, because a number of other motors would use wick and grease to feed a bearing, okay? They weren't necessarily potted motors. But this is also what I purchased, what was sold for these potted motors. Now, it's not, you know, if you look at it, this looks to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. And I'm pretty sure that it is. Well, I don't know if the original was, or if it shrank, but it's actually not. I think it's more like 3/16, but again, I could be wrong. So what we're going to do is going to take this original wick and simply use it as a template for the length. And I may add just a hair more, like 1/16 of an inch more length. Now, keep in mind that you have a certain distance that you want, right? So this spring, originally the old one, it came, you know, the what am I trying to say here? The original wick was probably, I don't know, a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch into the spring. And so ultimately you want your total length. Okay, so when you are looking at this, again, is the original wick. And when it was in the spring, it was, I want to say it was about this far into the spring. And so the whole length here is about, it's going to vary between 1 1/16 and 1 1/8 inch or so. Again, you can get it within 1/16 of an inch. You just want to make sure you have the height right. And the reason you want this is because you want there to be enough of the wick in the spring that it can kind of be held in by the spring, so it has a place to sit. So this, you know, again, the piece I cut off is a little longer here, and I can trim it back. I always like to start with a little more, and then I can trim it back. I may trim it back a little bit. Now, before you go trying to put this wick into the spring, you need to know that the spring is not as big around as the wick, and if you try to put it in there, it's gonna fight you, and you could damage your spring. So here's what I've had to do in order to get this to work. You can use an X-Acto blade, or you can even just use a good pair of scissors like I have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and I'm going to very carefully just trimming off, like I say, basically shaving it with the scissors here. Some of you may have better methods for doing this, and I may just do it on, I don't know, 3 different sides. It almost doesn't look like I'm taking anything off here, but I am. Again, it's easier to go back and take off more. If you take off too much, you know, you're kind of back to square one. All right, just do some more. And I'll do this twice, right? I'll do this for both these, but for the video, I'm just going to show you guys one. The other grease wick service is the same for this one. It's not any different. Now, what I'd like to do, I've trimmed that down a bit, because remember, it has to go down into the space where that wick lives. That's okay. But now I want to kind of give just a tad more of a sort of a beveling, right? Just a little bit more off of, I'm going back from one end here, about 1/4 of an inch, just trimming it off to give it a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a point, but more like a blunt crayon or something. Something that will help us get it back into the spring without any fuss. Now I can take the spring and I can turn the wick, right? Notice the spring is starting to slip over the wick there. And again, I didn't shave off much, guys. I mean, you can barely see the little fuzz I took off, but it helped. Some of you may not have done that, but I find this is helpful. Now, let's take, where's my measuring here? So we're going to take a look at this. Let's just come over here to the end. So now it looks like I have about 1 inch and about 1 1/8 inch. You could even do 1 1/16. You'd be okay. And if you don't have to cut the wick again, you can just come down a little further with the spring, the wick into the spring, and then you can get down to 1 1/16 of an inch. Even an inch is okay, I think. Now, we are going to be using our clip. This is why it was important to take this out without destroying it. What we're going to do is we're going to put the spring up into the section that sits. I'm trying to describe the shape of this thing. It's kind of funny, almost like a big arrow. But this area here to the left, underneath the left, is where that spring's going to seat, and you can see it upside down here, right? But it's going to seat. We'll see if it stays there. Underneath this part. This part of the clip is where your spring is sitting, okay? Now, we need to do a few things here. I'm going to get my grease. I use Singer lubricant. I'm going to get my grease. I normally try to keep it, I think I have it in a syringe. I don't know how much of that I have left.